The afternoon sun hung lazily in the sky, spilling warm light across the parking lot of a quiet supermarket on the edge of town. Families moved in and out of the sliding glass doors, some pushing carts full of groceries, others chatting about weekend plans. It was an ordinary Saturday, calm and uneventful, the kind of day that didn't hint anything unusual was about to happen. Inside the store, a man walked slowly down the aisles, picking up a few things for the week. He looked calm, thoughtful, dressed neatly in dark jeans and a jacket. He had a quiet kind of confidence, the kind that came from years of responsibility and discipline. What most people didn't know was that he worked for the FBI. He wasn't wearing anything that gave it away. No badge on his belt. No sign that he carried the weight of federal duty. He liked to live normally when he could, blending in with regular people, enjoying small moments like this. He pushed his cart toward the fresh produce section, checking a list on his phone. He smiled politely at an elderly woman reaching for apples and offered to help her grab the bag she couldn't reach. She thanked him kindly. It was a simple, decent moment between strangers, the kind that reminded him the world still had good people. Outside, across the parking lot, a patrol car rolled in slowly. The local police officer behind the wheel was responding to a vague call that had come through dispatch just minutes earlier. Someone had reported a suspicious man in the supermarket. Tall, dark jacket, acting strange. It wasn't much of a description, but the officer, known around the department for his quick temper and habit of jumping to conclusions, decided to check it out. He parked near the entrance, adjusted his sunglasses, and took a deep breath as if preparing for confrontation. In his mind, he was always ready for danger, but what he didn't realize was how his assumptions shaped his actions. He walked through the sliding doors with a stern face, hand resting lightly on his duty belt, scanning the aisles with sharp, searching eyes. The atmosphere in the supermarket changed slightly. Some customers noticed the officer and instinctively stepped aside. His heavy boots made a distinct sound against the polished floor as he walked. The store manager, confused, approached him and asked if there was a problem. The officer waved him off and continued walking, muttering that he was checking something out. Meanwhile, the FBI agent had just picked up a loaf of bread and a carton of milk when he noticed the officer walking toward him. He didn't think much of it at first. Police came and went from public places all the time. But when he saw the officer's tense expression, he sensed something was off. The officer stopped a few steps away and called out sharply, "Hey, let me see some identification." The agent turned slowly, a little puzzled. "Excuse me?" he asked calmly. "I said, show me some ID," the officer repeated, his tone hard. "We got a call about a suspicious person. You matched the description." A few shoppers nearby froze in place. Some looked down, others stared with wide eyes. The agent looked around, realizing everyone was watching. He could feel the uncomfortable silence pressing in. He wasn't angry, just surprised by how sudden and aggressive the situation had become. "I'm not sure what this is about," he said politely, "but I can show you my ID. It's in my wallet." "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked. His hand twitched near his holster. Slowly, the agent nodded, trying to stay calm. He had dealt with high-pressure situations before, and far worse than this. But this was different. He wasn't in a federal office or out on an operation. He was just a man shopping for groceries. The absurdity of it made him sigh quietly. He began to reach slowly for his back pocket, speaking clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. "My wallet is in my back pocket. I'm reaching for it now." But the officer's mind was already running wild. His instincts, clouded by bias and adrenaline, made him think every movement was a threat. He stepped back, hand tightening on his weapon. "Don't move!" he shouted suddenly, making everyone around them jump. The entire store went silent. A mother pulled her child closer. A cashier froze mid-scan. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed to disappear. The agent stopped moving immediately, hands slightly raised in front of him. His heart beat steadily, but not out of fear and out of disbelief. He knew that one wrong reaction could make this situation spiral out of control. "Officer," he said quietly, maintaining eye contact, "I'm reaching for my identification. I'm not armed and I'm not a threat to you." "Step back," the officer yelled, voice shaking slightly. "On the ground, now!" The man hesitated for half a second, trying to understand what had triggered this reaction. Then, Realizing resistance would only make things worse, he slowly got down on one knee, then the other. His grocery items rolled away as he lowered himself to the cold tile floor. Around him, whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone pulled out a phone and began recording. From his position on the ground, the agent kept his voice calm and firm. "You're making a mistake. I'm a federal agent. I have identification in my wallet." The officer didn't seem to hear him. His gun was drawn now, pointed directly at the man's chest. His breathing was heavy. Every second felt stretched, every movement amplified. In that moment, the agent wasn't thinking about rank, position, or pride. He was thinking about how quickly an ordinary day could turn into chaos. He thought about the importance of staying composed, not just for his own safety, but for everyone around him. One sudden move could put innocent people in danger. The store manager had already called for backup. "There's a situation," he whispered into the phone, and officers pulled a gun inside the store. "Please send someone quickly." Minutes passed, though they felt much longer. The officer stood rigid, weapon still drawn, his face tight with fear and something else. Confusion, maybe even guilt. Deep down, he sensed something wasn't right, but pride and panic kept him from backing down. The agent spoke again, steady but firm. "Look carefully. My badge is in my wallet. I'll slide it out slowly so you can see it. That's all I'm doing." No response. The officer's finger trembled near the trigger. Everyone in the store held their breath. The agent carefully reached into his pocket, his movements deliberate and slow. He pulled out the black leather wallet and placed it on the floor. Then with 2 fingers, he slid it forward. The wallet flipped open slightly, revealing a golden badge, the unmistakable insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The light from above caught the surface, making it glimmer for everyone to see. The silence broke with a wave of gasps. The store manager stepped forward cautiously, his eyes widening as he read the words on the badge. "He's FBI," someone whispered. "Oh my God, he's FBI." The officer blinked, eyes darting from the badge to the man on the floor. His posture shifted. The adrenaline that had been driving him began to fade, replaced by the heavy realization of what he had done. He lowered his weapon slightly, but didn't holster it yet. His lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. The agent stayed where he was, still calm, still controlled. He didn't gloat or raise his voice. He simply waited for reason to return to the room. Inside, he felt a mix of exhaustion and sadness. He had worked for years to build trust between law enforcement agencies. And here he was, humiliated, treated like a criminal in front of strangers. All because of an assumption. The officer finally muttered, "Let me see that badge." The agent nodded and gestured for him to take it. The officer knelt, picked it up, and stared at the seal. His expression changed completely, the stern, commanding look replaced by disbelief and regret. By now, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. More officers were on their way. The store's customers began whispering among themselves, telling each other what had happened, some recording every second. The air was thick with tension and shame. The agent stood up slowly, brushing off his jacket. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an apology. He just looked at the officer and said quietly, "You should have listened before you drew your weapon." Those words hung in the air as the sound of sirens grew louder outside. The officer didn't respond. His face told everything, the confusion, the guilt, and the fear of what would come next. As the agent gathered his scattered groceries, he glanced at the crowd. Some nodded at him, others looked away, unsure what to feel. He gave a small, polite nod to the store manager and said softly, "It's all right. No one got hurt." But deep down, everyone knew this moment would leave a mark. It wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about what happens when fear and bias take control, and how one calm man managed to stop chaos from turning into tragedy. Outside, the flashing lights painted the windows red and blue. The afternoon sun was still shining, but inside the store, the world had already changed. The air outside the supermarket was thick with tension. Police sirens echoed faintly as 2 patrol cars pulled up near the entrance, lights flashing in sharp red and blue reflections against the glass doors. Inside, the scene was still frozen in awkward silence. The officer who had drawn his gun now stood stiffly near the registers, his weapon finally holstered but his hands trembling slightly. He tried to act like everything was under control, but it was clear to everyone that he wasn't sure what to do next. The FBI agent stood calmly a few steps away, holding his badge in one hand. He didn't say much. His voice had already done enough, measured, calm, and respectful even when he was the one being humiliated. He looked around the store at the faces of the shoppers, most of them still in shock. Some people had put down their groceries and were just standing there, not knowing if it was safe to move. Others whispered quietly to one another, trying to piece together what had really happened. When the backup officers entered the store, the atmosphere shifted again. They expected a dangerous situation, but what they found instead was confusion. One of the responding officers looked at his colleague, the one who had caused all the chaos, and frowned deeply. He could already sense something was wrong. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from one man to the other. The first officer cleared his throat and spoke quickly. "There was a report of a suspicious person. I was just checking it out." The words sounded weak even to him. The other officers looked at the FBI badge glinting in the agent's hand. One of them recognized it instantly, and his expression changed to disbelief. "Wait, he's FBI?" he asked quietly. The agent nodded slightly. "Yes, sir. I tried to explain that before a gun was pointed at me." His tone wasn't bitter, just factual, but those few words hit harder than any accusation could have. The officer who had started it all opened his mouth to explain himself, but no one was listening. The backup officers looked uncomfortable. They had all seen bad situations, but this was something that made everyone uneasy. The agent tucked his badge back into his jacket and spoke again, his voice steady. "I'm fine. Nobody was hurt, but this could have ended very differently." He looked around the store once more, his eyes resting briefly on a young mother holding her child close. The little boy still looked scared. The agent gave them a small nod, as if to silently say everything was okay now. The store manager finally stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Sir, I'm so sorry about all of this." "We didn't know what was happening. Do you need us to call anyone?" The agent shook his head. "No need. I just want to speak to whoever's in charge of your police department." The officer who caused the mess swallowed hard. "That would be the chief," he muttered, his voice low. "Good," the agent replied simply. "Then I'll wait." He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand anything. His calmness was powerful. People could feel it. The quiet control of someone who had faced far more dangerous moments than this, and yet handled it with discipline and grace. Within minutes, word had spread outside. Officers waiting by their cars began talking in low tones. A few employees from nearby stores had gathered at the edge of the parking lot, trying to see what the commotion was about. The situation had turned into something no one could ignore. Inside, the officer paced near the registers, his mind racing. He was sweating now, realizing that every second of his actions was being recorded by store cameras, and worse, by the people still holding up their phones. The look on his face made it clear he knew he had crossed a line. The agent stood quietly near the door, arms crossed, waiting. He wasn't smug or arrogant, but there was a certain calm strength in his posture, the kind that comes from someone who knows the truth will eventually speak for itself. After about 15 minutes, another car pulled up outside. The police chief stepped out, a tall, middle-aged man with a serious expression. He had received a call from dispatch saying one of his officers had engaged a civilian at gunpoint inside a store, and now the civilian was claiming to be a federal agent. The chief didn't waste time. He walked straight through the sliding doors, his eyes scanning the crowd before focusing on the agent. The store manager pointed in their direction. "That's him, sir. The man in the jacket. And that's your officer." The chief turned to the agent and extended his hand politely. "I'm the chief of police. I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The agent shook his hand briefly. "That's one way to put it." The chief could already tell this wasn't a small issue. The way people were watching, the way phones were still pointed in their direction, this was serious. He glanced at his officer, who looked pale and nervous. "Tell me exactly what happened," the chief demanded. The officer stumbled over his words. "I got a call about a suspicious person, Chief. He matched the description, so I approached. He made a move for his pocket, so I drew my weapon. I didn't know he was—" The chief cut him off. "You didn't know he was what?" The officer swallowed hard. "A federal agent." The chief turned back to the agent. "Is that true, sir? You're with the Bureau?" The agent took out his badge again, this time handing it directly to the chief. The older man studied it carefully, his eyes narrowing as the reality of the situation sank in. He let out a slow breath, then handed it back. I see, he said quietly. This shouldn't have happened. The agent nodded. You're right. It shouldn't have. The chief turned to his officer again. His tone hardened. You pointed a weapon at a federal officer inside a public store? In front of civilians? The officer stammered. I thought he was reaching for something. Did you ask him? I gave commands, sir, but you didn't listen, the chief interrupted sharply. You reacted. That's not policing, that's panic. The silence that followed was heavy. Every shopper nearby could hear every word. The officer looked down, avoiding everyone's eyes. The chief shook his head slowly, disappointment clear in his face. He turned back to the agent. I want to personally apologize. On behalf of the department and this town. This is not how we operate. The agent gave a respectful nod. I appreciate that. I know everyone has a job to do, but it's important that those jobs are done the right way. The chief sighed. You're absolutely right. And this, he glanced at his officer again, isn't the right way. He stepped closer to his subordinate, lowering his voice but still loud enough for everyone to hear. You're relieved of duty effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon now. The officer's eyes widened. Sir? Now, the chief repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The moment felt surreal. The officer, realizing there was no way out, unclipped his badge and placed it in his chief's hand. He then removed his firearm and holstered it on the counter. The chief turned to one of the other officers nearby. Escort him outside. The officer looked crushed, but he didn't argue. He walked out silently, his head down. People watched as he left the store, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the tile. Once he was gone, the chief turned back to the agent. His expression softened. I know this won't erase what happened, but please know this will be handled properly. The behavior you experienced today is not something I'll ever tolerate. The agent nodded, appreciating the chief's honesty. Thank you, Chief, that means a lot. I don't want this to become a bigger scene. I just want it to be a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous. I couldn't agree more, the chief replied. A few customers started clapping quietly, a spontaneous gesture that spread through the store. The agent looked a bit uncomfortable with the attention, but he smiled politely and nodded to the crowd. The chief extended his hand again. If there's anything you need, a report, an apology letter from the department, just let me know. I want to make this right. I appreciate it, the agent said. Just knowing that you took responsibility means enough. With that, the chief turned to the rest of the room. Everything's fine now, folks. You can continue shopping. Thank you for your patience. People slowly began to move again, conversations returning, carts rolling down aisles. But the energy in the air was different. Everyone had just witnessed something powerful. The moment accountability stood above pride. As the agent gathered his groceries, the store manager came over again, still looking shaken. Sir, I've worked here 10 years. I've never seen anything like that. The agent smiled faintly. Let's hope none of us ever have to again. He paid for his items, thanked the cashier, and walked out into the late afternoon light. The parking lot had mostly cleared, but a few people were still standing nearby, watching quietly as he loaded his groceries into his car. The chief approached one last time before he left. You handled yourself with more patience than most would. Thank you for that. The agent simply nodded. Doing the right thing shouldn't depend on a badge. It should depend on being human. The chief looked thoughtful, almost humbled, and replied softly, You're right about that. As the agent drove away, the flashing lights faded in his rearview mirror. The town would soon talk about what happened in that supermarket, about how one man's calmness exposed another's weakness, and how a chief's quick decision showed the difference between leadership and ego. It was just another afternoon in a small town, but for everyone who had been there, it was a day they wouldn't forget. The supermarket had returned to its usual rhythm. The sound of carts rolling and quiet chatter filled the air again. But for many people who had witnessed the incident, the tension still lingered in the back of their minds. They couldn't forget what they had seen. An officer pointing a gun at a calm man who had done nothing wrong, and then the chief stepping in to make things right. It was the kind of moment that made people think about how quickly a simple day could turn into a story they'd never forget. Outside, the chief stood by his car, still processing what had happened. He had seen many incidents during his years in the department, But this one struck a different chord. It wasn't just about an officer making a bad call. It was about what that mistake represented. He couldn't help thinking about how the world saw law enforcement, and how one wrong action could destroy trust that took years to build. He leaned against the door of his car, watching the FBI agent drive away, calm and composed as if he'd just handled another day at work. The chief respected that kind of composure. Most people would have shouted, demanded punishment, maybe even called the media. But the agent had chosen patience and dignity. That, the chief thought, was true professionalism. A few minutes later, one of the younger officers approached. "Chief," he said quietly, "the others are asking what happens next. Should we take the reports now?" The chief nodded. "Yes, get statements from everyone who saw what happened. I want full documentation, every witness, every camera angle." The younger officer hesitated. "And about him?" He meant the officer who had caused the problem. The chief looked toward the patrol car where the dismissed officer sat silently in the back seat, staring at the floor. His once confident posture was gone. He looked small, almost lost. "Take him back to the station," the chief said firmly. "We'll handle the paperwork there. And make sure the internal review starts today." The younger officer nodded and walked off, leaving the chief alone with his thoughts. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of leadership pressing down on him. Moments like this were the hardest, when doing the right thing meant standing against one of your own. Meanwhile, the FBI agent drove down the quiet suburban road, the afternoon sunlight flickering through the trees. He turned off the radio and let the silence fill the car. His mind replayed the event again and again. The officer's voice, the drawn gun, the frightened faces in the supermarket. He wasn't angry anymore, just deeply reflective. He had spent years working undercover, investigating organized crime, cyber cases, and national threats. He had seen danger up close, dealt with people far more violent and unpredictable. But this had been different. It was personal. It was the kind of situation that showed how easily fear and bias could cloud judgment. When he reached a red light, he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't look shaken on the outside, but inside he felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness that something like this could still happen, and relief that it hadn't turned deadly. He drove on until he reached a small coffee shop near his home. He parked, stepped out, and walked inside. The familiar smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air, and the sound of quiet music played in the background. The barista smiled at him. "The usual?" He nodded.
"Yes, please." As he waited, his phone buzzed.
It was a message from a colleague at the bureau. "Heard something went down at the store. You okay?" He smiled faintly and replied, "I'm fine. Just a misunderstanding that got out of hand." The reply came almost instantly. "A misunderstanding with a gun involved? Sounds like something the media would love to twist." He sighed and put the phone down. The last thing he wanted was attention. He wasn't interested in becoming the center of a story that would make headlines. He just wanted people to learn from it, quietly, meaningfully. He took his coffee and sat near the window, watching the cars pass by. Every so often he glanced at the people outside. Families walking, friends laughing, kids playing near the sidewalk. It reminded him why he chose his line of work. It wasn't for power or recognition. It was for the safety of ordinary people who deserved to live without fear. Back at the police station, the chief sat in his office, reading the preliminary reports. Each statement told the same story. An officer had reacted too fast, ignored the warnings, and created panic in a public place. The chief sighed heavily. He'd always believed in fairness, and part of fairness meant holding his own accountable when they made serious mistakes. The dismissed officer sat outside the office, waiting. His head was lowered, his badge and weapon already turned in. Another officer handed him a paper cup of water, but he barely touched it. He knew what was coming. When the chief finally called him in, he stood up slowly and entered the room. The door closed softly behind him. "Sit down," the chief said. The man obeyed, sitting stiffly on the chair opposite the desk. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact. The chief spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "You've been with this department for 5 years. You've had good work before, but what happened today was unacceptable. You pulled a gun on an innocent man, a federal agent no less, him in front of a crowd. That's not just poor judgment. That's reckless behavior." The officer swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't mean for it to go that far. I really thought—" "That's the problem," the chief interrupted. You thought, but you didn't check. You didn't listen. You didn't follow procedure. You let your fear make the decisions. There was silence for a moment. The officer finally looked up, his face pale. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I know you didn't, the chief said softly. But intentions don't undo actions. You could have caused a tragedy today. Do you understand that? The man nodded weakly. Yes, sir. I've already filed your dismissal, the chief continued. You'll go through the review board, and there'll be an official report sent to the State Oversight Office. I can't protect you from that. You'll also be required to attend retraining if you ever want to work in law enforcement again. The officer closed his eyes for a moment, the reality settling in. His career, the one he had worked hard to build, was slipping away. The chief leaned forward. I'm not saying this to destroy you. I'm saying this because this job requires more than a uniform and a badge. It requires judgment, empathy, and restraint. You lost control today, and that can never happen again. The officer nodded silently, tears welling in his eyes but never falling. He stood up slowly, whispered a quiet, I'm sorry, and left the room. When the door closed, the chief let out a long sigh. He looked at the file one last time before setting it aside. Leadership, he thought, wasn't about power. It was about responsibility, the kind that weighed on you even when no one else saw it. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, the chief decided to call the FBI agent personally. He wanted to make sure the situation was officially resolved. The call rang twice before the agent answered. Good evening, Chief, the agent said. His tone was polite but a little weary. Good evening, the chief replied. I just wanted to let you know the officer has been dismissed and the report has been filed. I wanted you to hear it directly from me. I appreciate that, the agent said, and I appreciate how you handled it. You didn't hesitate to do the right thing. The chief was quiet for a moment. I wish it hadn't happened at all. But thank you. We'll be using this as a lesson in the department. It's a reminder for all of us. That's all I could ask for, the agent said. Sometimes the best way to change a system is to start with one honest action. The chief nodded, though the other man couldn't see it. Take care of yourself, agent, and thank you for your patience today. Take care. Chief. When the call ended, both men sat quietly in their separate spaces, one in his office, one in his home, each reflecting on the strange day that had brought them together. The agent finished his coffee and looked out the window as the last light faded. He felt no anger, just a quiet sense of closure. What had happened couldn't be undone, but maybe it could mean something. Maybe it could make a difference. Somewhere in that small town, a story had unfolded that would be remembered for a long time. A story about how pride, fear, and misunderstanding could create chaos, but also how honesty, restraint, and leadership could bring calm again. It was proof that even in tense, divided moments, there were still people who chose what was right over what was easy, and sometimes that choice made all the difference. The sound of sirens grew louder outside the supermarket. People inside were whispering, recording, and staring toward the front doors where flashing lights painted the glass red and blue. The tension was thick in the air, and even though the officer had finally lowered his gun, the shock still lingered. The FBI agent stayed still, calm and patient even though his heart was pounding. He had been through life-threatening missions before, but never something like this. Not in a grocery store, not in his own city, and not at the hands of someone who was supposed to be his ally in law enforcement. When the doors swung open, the police chief walked in with two other senior officers. He didn't come rushing or yelling. He walked slowly, his face unreadable, his steps heavy with responsibility. The crowd instinctively moved aside, giving him space. The supermarket manager came running toward him, speaking quickly, pointing toward the scene that had unfolded. The chief raised a hand gently, signaling for silence. He didn't want stories. He wanted facts. He looked first at the officer who had caused the commotion. The man looked nervous now, his earlier arrogance gone. His hands were shaking slightly, his eyes darting between the chief and the agent who was now standing quietly near the produce aisle. The chief could already read the situation from the faces of the witnesses, and the camera still recording from a shopper's phone. He had seen this look before, the uneasy combination of guilt and fear. The chief approached the FBI agent and spoke in a respectful tone. Sir, are you all right? The agent nodded calmly. I'm fine, Chief. I tried to explain who I was, but things got out of hand. The chief turned to look at the officer again. Is that true? The officer swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. Chief, I thought he was reaching for a weapon. The report said a suspicious man was here. I just reacted. The chief's expression didn't change. Did you verify the report? Did you ask for ID before pulling your weapon? The officer hesitated. The silence that followed spoke louder than any excuse could. Everyone watching knew the answer. The chief sighed deeply. His voice remained calm but firm. Lower your weapon now. The officer quickly obeyed. The supermarket was so quiet that even the soft clatter of the gun being holstered seemed loud. The chief motioned to another officer to take the weapon away temporarily. Then turning to the agent, he said softly, On behalf of this department, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve this. The agent nodded politely. I appreciate that, Chief. I know these things can happen fast. I just hope lessons are learned from this. The chief took a deep breath, looking around at the crowd. Families, children, elderly shoppers, all watching to see what justice would look like in real time. They will, he said quietly. He then faced his officer directly. You made a serious mistake. You pointed a gun at an unarmed man without clear reason. That alone is unacceptable. But this man is also a federal agent, one who's risked his life for this country. Do you realize how close you came to turning this into something tragic? The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Chief, please, he finally whispered. It was just a misunderstanding. The chief's eyes hardened. A misunderstanding that could have cost a man his life. Do you understand what that means? The officer stayed silent. The chief gestured toward the two senior officers who had come with him. Escort him outside. The two stepped forward gently, guiding the officer toward the doors. As they walked past the crowd, the air was filled with quiet murmurs. Some people shook their heads, others looked relieved. A few clapped softly, not out of joy but out of respect for the chief's integrity. Once outside, the chief turned back to the agent. Sir, I'm going to review all footage and reports myself. You have my word this will be handled properly. The agent gave a slight smile, though his eyes still showed disappointment. Thank you, Chief. I didn't want this to become an argument. I just wanted to be treated fairly. I understand, the chief said, and I'll make sure you are. The atmosphere began to ease a little. People started talking again, the tension slowly melting away. The supermarket staff tried to comfort the frightened customers, especially the children who had witnessed the scene. The chief asked one of his team members to collect the security camera footage and statements from the witnesses before leaving. As the officer was being led outside, he turned one last time toward the chief. I didn't mean any harm, he said quietly. I thought I was doing my job. The chief's voice softened, but his words carried weight. Doing your job doesn't mean forgetting your judgment. The badge doesn't give you power to act on assumptions. It gives you responsibility to protect with fairness and restraint. Those words hung in the air long after the officer was taken to the squad car. The chief then walked to the store's front where several reporters had already gathered. Someone must have called the local news station. Cameras were pointed, microphones were ready, and everyone wanted to know what had happened. The chief didn't shy away. He stood tall and spoke clearly. An incident occurred inside. An officer drew his weapon unnecessarily on an individual who turned out to be an FBI agent. The situation is under control and the officer involved has been removed from duty pending investigation. The reporters shouted more questions, but the chief didn't elaborate. He wanted facts before statements. He turned and walked back to the agent, who was now waiting by his car. I appreciate how you handled yourself, the chief said. You could have escalated this, but you didn't. The agent nodded. There was no need to. I've seen what happens when anger takes over. I wasn't going to add to that. Still, the chief said with quiet admiration, you showed a lot of patience. More than many would. The two men shook hands. It wasn't just a gesture of respect. It was a silent understanding between two people who believed in the same thing, that justice only works when it's fair for everyone. Later that evening, the chief went back to his office. He replayed the footage several times, each frame confirming what witnesses had described. The agent had been calm from start to finish. The officer had acted on bias, not threat. There was no gray area. The chief filled out the dismissal papers himself. He didn't send them to Human Resources or an internal committee first. He wanted this to be direct and transparent. He knew that the community was watching. He knew that every action would be judged. But he also knew that doing the right thing was not about pleasing the public. It was about maintaining the trust that law enforcement depends on. When he finished signing the paperwork, he looked out of his office window at the city below. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the streets. It had been a long day, and he felt the weight of his decisions. But somewhere deep down there was also a quiet sense of peace. Across town, the FBI agent sat at his kitchen table, sipping tea. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues who had already heard what happened. He replied briefly to a few, saying he was fine and didn't want to make it a bigger issue. He wasn't angry, just thoughtful. He knew that sometimes change began not in big speeches or public protests, but in small moments of courage, in quiet stands for what's right. Meanwhile, the supermarket reopened the next morning. The same people who had witnessed the chaos returned, talking softly about how quickly things had turned around. Some said it restored their faith in leadership. Others said they were just grateful it ended peacefully. The chief made a personal visit later that week. He spoke with the store employees, apologized again, and thanked them for their composure. Then he turned to the security camera on the ceiling and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that sometimes the truth doesn't need defending. It just needs to be seen. That single day became a story the town would never forget, not because of the mistake, but because of how it was handled. It showed that even in moments of tension and fear, integrity could still shine through. And for both the chief and the FBI agent, that was enough. The next morning, the news had already spread across town. Everyone was talking about the supermarket incident. Neighbors, workers, even students at the local college. People couldn't believe what had happened, and even more so, they couldn't believe how quickly the police chief had acted. In a world where justice often took weeks or months, the chief had made a decision right there on the spot, and that single choice had caught the attention of everyone. At the police station, there was a strange quietness that morning. The officers who had worked under the one who pulled the gun came in without saying much. They were uneasy, not because the chief had done something wrong, but because they knew what it meant. Accountability had finally caught up with one of their own, and it made everyone reflect on their own actions. The chief walked into the department at exactly 8 a.m., holding a file under his arm. He nodded at the front desk officer and went straight to his office. Inside, he placed the file on his desk, sat down, and stared at the badge he had taken the day before. It was sitting there quietly in an envelope, the number still visible through the paper. That badge had once represented service and trust. Now, it was a reminder of how easily those things could be lost when someone forgot the true meaning of the job. He took a deep breath and began typing an internal statement to his team. He didn't want rumors or mixed stories to spread within the department. He wanted honesty and clarity. His message was short but firm. He wrote, "Yesterday, an incident occurred that does not reflect the values of our department. One of our own made a serious judgment error that could have ended tragically. I have made the decision to dismiss the officer involved, effective immediately. We serve to protect and not to intimidate. Let this remind us all that respect, patience, and fairness must guide our every action. We cannot let prejudice or assumptions control our duty. Justice starts with accountability, and accountability starts with us." He read the message twice, then sent it to every officer in the department. Minutes later, phones buzzed across desks and officers began reading the statement. Some sat in silence. Others nodded, agreeing with every word. For a few, it was a wake-up call, a moment that made them realize the weight of the badge they wore every day. Meanwhile, at the FBI field office, the agent from the supermarket was sitting quietly at his desk. His colleagues had been supportive, offering kind words and concern. But he didn't want attention. He didn't want to be known as the agent from the viral video. He wanted people to focus on the lesson, not the event. When his supervisor walked into the room, the agent stood. The supervisor placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "I heard what happened. You handled it the right way." The agent nodded. "I didn't want to make things worse. I just wanted to stay calm." "You did more than that," the supervisor said. "You showed restraint and respect even when you were disrespected. That's not weakness, and that's strength, and it made a difference." The agent gave a small smile, though his eyes still showed a quiet sadness. "It shouldn't have happened, though. Not like that. Not between people who wear badges." "I know," his supervisor said, "but maybe this will make others think before they act." Sometimes one bad moment teaches 100 others. Later that day, the police chief and the FBI agent spoke again over the phone. The chief wanted to personally update him on the department's actions. "Everything's been handled," the chief said. "The officer's dismissal is official. It'll be on record." "I appreciate that, Chief," the agent replied calmly. "You didn't have to act that fast, but you did. That means a lot." "I did what was right," the chief said simply. "That's what this uniform stands for, or at least what it should stand for." There was a short pause before the agent said, "You know, the strange thing is, I wasn't angry at him. Not really. I was disappointed, but not angry. I've seen hate in the field before, but I always believed that inside our own law enforcement family, things were different." "I understand," the chief said quietly. "But we both know sometimes people lose their way. That's why we have to correct it. Not with hatred, but with discipline." The conversation ended on a respectful note. Both men understood each other deeply. Two people from different departments, bonded by the same principle: justice with integrity. By evening, news reporters were standing outside the police station, waiting for a public statement. The chief knew he couldn't avoid it forever. The public deserved transparency, so he stepped outside wearing a calm but serious expression and faced the cameras. He spoke slowly, with sincerity in every word. "Yesterday, one of our officers made a grave mistake. He acted without verifying the facts, and in doing so, he endangered an innocent person. That person was a federal agent. The actions taken were unacceptable and do not represent this department or the values we stand for. The officer involved has been dismissed from duty. We take full responsibility, and we are reviewing training and procedures to ensure this never happens again." The reporters asked questions about bias, about reform, about accountability. The chief answered each one with patience, never hiding behind excuses. "This is not about one man," he said. "It's about the culture we build as officers. Every action, every word, every decision, it shapes public trust. When we forget that, we lose the meaning of service." The news clip went viral that night. People across the country shared it, praising the chief for being honest and decisive. Social media was filled with comments like, "Finally, a leader who stands for what's right," and "This is what real accountability looks like." But not everyone celebrated. Some critics said the chief had been too harsh. A few others claimed the officer deserved another chance. The chief didn't respond to those arguments. He knew that leadership wasn't about popularity. It was about doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. Meanwhile, the agent watched the news quietly from home. He didn't smile, but there was a small sense of relief inside him. It wasn't about revenge or satisfaction. It was about seeing fairness prevail. He thought about the chief's words, "Justice starts with accountability." That line stayed with him for days. A week later, the chief received a letter from the FBI director himself, commending his quick and ethical handling of the situation. The letter stated that cooperation between agencies depended on trust, and the chief's actions had strengthened that trust. The chief placed the letter in his drawer. He didn't need recognition, but it reminded him that doing the right thing still mattered. As time went on, the story slowly faded from headlines, but it left an imprint on everyone who had witnessed it. Inside the police department, officers began to speak more openly about training, empathy, and decision-making. The chief started a new workshop series focused on community respect and unbiased policing. He even invited the FBI agent to speak one afternoon. When the agent arrived, the room was full of officers, some curious, some uncomfortable. He stood in front of them and spoke softly. "What happened to me could happen to anyone, and not everyone would have stayed calm. We're all human. We all make mistakes. But our job gives us power. And with that power comes the duty to pause, think, and see people as people, not as suspects." The room was silent. Every word landed deeply. Even those who hadn't agreed with the chief's decision began to understand. After the session ended, one young officer approached the agent privately. "I just wanted to say," he said nervously, "that you changed how I see things. I'll remember your words next time I'm out there." The agent smiled gently. "That's all I could ever hope for." That night, the chief walked out of the station feeling proud, not because of the praise or the headlines, but because something real had changed. His team had learned. His community had seen justice done, And somewhere deep down, the quiet man in the supermarket had reminded everyone of the value of patience, courage, and respect. Sometimes, it doesn't take grand speeches or court trials to make things right. Sometimes all it takes is one person standing still while others lose their calm. Sometimes it takes a leader willing to say, "Enough. This is not who we are." And that was exactly what happened in that small town. A single moment of fairness that echoed much farther than anyone expected. A few weeks passed after the supermarket incident, and life in the small town began to return to normal. The supermarket reopened fully, the police department went back to routine work, and the headlines that had once dominated local news slowly disappeared. But for the people who had been part of that day, things didn't just fade away. They carried lessons, quiet thoughts, and a new sense of awareness about how quickly ordinary moments can turn into life-changing ones. The FBI agent continued his regular work at the field office. On the surface, nothing seemed different. He came in early, worked quietly, and left late. But deep inside, he felt something had shifted. For years, he had believed in order, in discipline, in the idea that everyone wearing a badge understood the same moral code. But that day had reminded him that not everyone saw the world the same way. Still, he refused to grow bitter. He believed that progress only came when good people didn't give up. So instead of anger, he chose patience. Instead of distance, he chose connection. Whenever younger agents came to him for advice, he didn't tell them about the danger of crime or the difficulty of long cases. He told them about judgment, about kindness, and about keeping calm when others lose theirs. He once said during a quiet lunch at the office, "It's not the situations that define you. It's what you do when you're misunderstood, when you're treated unfairly, that shows who you really are." His words spread quietly among his coworkers. Many of them started to see him differently, not just as a senior agent, but as someone who truly lived the values they talked about. Meanwhile, the police chief also noticed small changes in his department. The tension that had once existed between officers and the community began to soften. People in the neighborhood started greeting officers again, waving when patrol cars passed by. The chief made sure his team spent time walking on foot through local markets and parks, talking to residents, asking about their concerns, and listening more than they spoke. One afternoon, the chief visited a local school where students had been studying current events. The teacher had invited him to speak to the class about leadership and fairness. When he entered, the students clapped politely, and one curious boy asked, "Sir, how do you make such quick decisions when something goes wrong?" The chief smiled and replied, "By remembering that a uniform doesn't make you better than anyone else. It just gives you a duty to protect, not to control. Every decision I make, I ask myself one thing: would I be proud of this choice if the world saw it?" The classroom fell quiet, and even the teacher seemed moved. It wasn't a grand speech, but the sincerity behind it reached everyone listening. Later that evening, the chief sat in his office long after everyone had left. He opened the file on the case one last time. Inside were the statements, the official reports, the officer's dismissal notice, and the thank you letter from the FBI. He read through them slowly. None of it felt like victory. It felt more like responsibility, the kind that stays with a person forever. As he was closing the file, he saw the name of the agent again and thought about how calm the man had been that day. The chief had replayed that moment in his mind many times, how the agent never raised his voice, never lost control, even with a gun pointed at him. That kind of restraint wasn't ordinary. It came from experience, discipline, and deep character. He decided to write a short personal note to the agent, not an official letter, but a simple thank you. He wrote, "You showed me and my team what real professionalism looks like. I hope you know that your patience changed more minds than any policy ever could. Thank you for setting an example not just for officers, but for people everywhere." He mailed it quietly, without fanfare, knowing it was the right thing to do. A few days later, the agent received the envelope on his desk. When he read the chief's words, a warm smile spread across his face. It wasn't about recognition. It was about knowing that his calmness had meant something, that even silence, when used wisely, could speak louder than anger. That weekend, the agent went back to the same supermarket for the first time since the incident. He walked through the aisles casually, pushing a cart. Some of the staff recognized him but didn't say anything at first. Then the store manager, an older man with kind eyes, approached him quietly. "Sir," he said gently, "we all saw what happened that day. You handled yourself with so much grace. I just wanted to thank you." The agent smiled and replied, "Thank you for saying that. I just did what anyone should do. I stay calm and trust the truth to come out." A few other customers nearby overheard and nodded. One woman said softly, "You reminded people what patience looks like. The world needs more of that." He didn't know how to respond, so he just smiled politely and continued shopping. But as he left the store that day, he noticed something subtle, a sense of peace in the air, a feeling that the place was no longer remembered for chaos, but for how it ended, with understanding and fairness. That night, the chief sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the quiet streets of his town. The sun had set and the streetlights had just begun to glow. He thought about all the years he'd spent in uniform, the cases he'd solved, the mistakes he'd made, and the lessons he'd learned. But none of them felt as meaningful as this one simple truth. Leadership isn't about control. It's about compassion. He remembered something his mentor had told him long ago when he was a young officer. When people lose faith in the badge, they don't lose faith in the law. They lose faith in the people behind it. Never give them a reason to. Those words came back to him that night. He realized he had lived up to them, at least this time. Across town, the agent sat by his window reading a book. But his mind wasn't on the pages. He kept thinking about how one small moment of injustice had led to so many acts of integrity. The chief's courage, the officer's willingness to learn, the community's healing. It reminded him that sometimes even painful moments serve a purpose. He closed the book and whispered quietly to himself, "Maybe this is what change looks like, not loud, not fast, but real." The next morning, the chief and the agent met again, not for an investigation or report, but for coffee at a small diner. They talked about their families, their work, and the world they both hoped to see. The conversation was easy, like two old friends sharing lessons. Before leaving, the chief said, "You know, that day could have gone 100 different ways. I'm glad it ended the way it did." "So am I," the agent replied, "because it showed people that doing the right thing still matters." As they shook hands and went their separate ways, there was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken promise to keep standing for what was right. Even when it was hard, the story didn't end with anger or punishment. It ended with growth, with change, and with a reminder that humanity still lives within systems that often seem too rigid. Months later, a small plaque was placed inside the police station's training room. It read, "Integrity is not proven by power but by restraint. Justice is not measured by punishment but by fairness." Every new recruit read those words on their first day, and though many never knew the full story behind them, the spirit of that lesson lived on. The chief eventually retired a year later, leaving behind a department that was stronger, wiser, and more respected than before. The agent continued serving in the FBI, mentoring younger agents and carrying the same calm strength that had defined him that day in the supermarket. Neither man sought fame or praise. They didn't need to. They had something far more lasting, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when faced with wrong, they chose to stand on the side of right. And that was enough.